Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not a story about pills. This is a story about how an entire nation learned to medicate its anxieties away, how a pharmaceutical company built an empire on reassurance, how a single chemical compound became woven into the fabric of American domestic life so thoroughly that it seemed inseparable from the very idea of modern existence. This is a story about what happens when profit margins become more important than human well-being, when marketing triumphs over truth, when the medical establishment becomes complicit in a catastrophe of their own creation. Phone away, distractions silenced. What you're about to hear is a documented history of one of America's most catastrophic pharmaceutical disasters. A crisis that unfolded not in shadows, not in hidden laboratories, not in the margins of society, but in plain sight in the consultation rooms of physicians in white coats, in the glossy pages of women's magazines, in the lyrics of rock and roll legends. This is the rise and fall of Valium. And more importantly, this is a story about what we chose to ignore. Let's begin in the moments before the transformation, in the liminal space of the late 1950s, when America stood at a threshold between one era and another. The post-war boom had created a new kind of American, not one struggling with survival, not one preoccupied with putting food on the table, but one struggling with success. Suburbs sprawled across the landscape like concrete flowers blooming across the face of the continent. Women had tasted economic independence and professional achievement during the war years, manufacturing the implements of conflict in factories across the nation, and now they were being methodically pushed back into homes and domestic roles. Men were expected to be providers, protectors, unshakable pillars of domestic and economic order. Competition for status and achievement was fierce and relentless. But beneath the manicured lawns and the white picket fences, beneath the appearance of perfect contentment that defined the aspirational American dream, something was gnawing at the American psyche. A kind of creeping dread. An unnamed anxiety that didn't fit into the narrative of progress and prosperity. An emotional disturbance that couldn't be discussed in polite company, couldn't be acknowledged without admitting failure, couldn't be explored without challenging the entire structure of what Americans had been told their lives should be. What do you do when your life is supposed to be perfect, but something inside you feels fundamentally broken? What do you do with an anxiety that society tells you shouldn't exist? In the previous decade, in the 1950s, doctors had an answer, but it was an answer that came with a terrible price. Barbiturates, these sedative drugs, compounds with names like phenobarbital and pentobarbital, like Seconal and Nembutal, had been available since the 1920s and 1930s. They worked. They genuinely, undeniably worked. They quieted the racing mind. They suppressed the intrusive thoughts. They induced sleep in those tortured by insomnia. They created a chemical blanket of numbness that allowed people to function despite their internal turmoil. But they came with a cost so terrible that it began to rival the condition they were meant to treat. Barbiturates were profoundly addictive. They were extremely dangerous in overdose. They synergized fatally with alcohol, a combination that was depressingly common in a nation where alcohol was the socially acceptable drug. Throughout the 1950s, accidental deaths from barbiturate overdose became increasingly common, increasingly visible, increasingly impossible to ignore. Hollywood starlets with names that the tabloids made famous died in their bedrooms, surrounded by empty bottles and tragic circumstance. Housewives overdosed while managing the stress of domestic life. The drugs that were supposed to save people were killing them instead. The medical establishment was in crisis. Doctors needed something safer. They needed a drug that could quiet the anxious mind without the lethal consequences lurking in every barbiturate tablet. And they needed it urgently. This is where our story truly begins. In 1959, in the laboratories of Hoffmann-La Roche, a pharmaceutical company headquartered in Basel, Switzerland, but with growing and ambitious operations in the United States, chemists were working on a new class of compounds that would transform psychiatry and pharmacology forever. These compounds belonged to a family called benzodiazepines. The lead chemist on the project was a man named Leo Sternbach, a Polish-born researcher who had been synthesizing compounds and exploring chemical structures for decades. The narrative that was later constructed around his discovery, the story that Hoffmann-La Roche wanted the world to believe, was that Sternbach was working on a different project entirely when he created this miraculous compound almost by accident, an unplanned scientific serendipity that would change everything. On April 19, 1959, one of his synthesized molecules, a yellow crystalline substance with a particular atomic arrangement, would become the foundation of an empire worth billions of dollars. The compound was called chlordiazepoxide, but the world would come to know it by its brand name, Librium. It was not the last benzodiazepine Hoffmann-La Roche would create, but it was the first, and it opened a door that would never close. Librium was revolutionary, or so the marketing materials proclaimed. Unlike barbiturates, it didn't cause respiratory depression. The user wouldn't stop breathing from an overdose. You couldn't easily kill yourself by taking too many Librium pills, which meant that suicidal patients on the drug were at lower risk of successful suicide. And critically, Librium had a mechanism that seemed almost miraculous. It calmed the mind and reduced anxiety without rendering the user unconscious. A person taking Librium could remain functional, could remain awake, could remain aware. They could work. They could drive. They could perform their daily duties, meet their obligations, maintain their appearance of normalcy while the anxiety that threatened to consume them from within was chemically suppressed into manageable proportions. The FDA approved Librium in 1960, moving with the deliberate speed that would become characteristic of their relationship with benzodiazepines. It was hailed as a breakthrough, as a miracle of modern chemistry, as evidence that pharmaceutical science could solve the problems of the human psyche. Here, finally, was a drug that could manage the epidemic of anxiety sweeping through suburban America without the lethal consequences of its predecessors. The medical community embraced it. Doctors began prescribing it. The revolution had begun. But Librium was only the beginning. Hoffmann-La Roche knew they had struck pharmaceutical gold, and they moved quickly to capitalize on their discovery, to expand their market, to create an entire category of drugs that the company could control and profit from indefinitely. In 1963, just 3 years after Librium's release, they introduced a new benzodiazepine into the American market. It was more potent than Librium. It worked faster, reaching therapeutic levels in the bloodstream more quickly. It lasted longer in the body, requiring less frequent dosing. It was, in short, a superior product from a marketing perspective, a drug that could be taken once or twice daily instead of multiple times, a drug that worked faster and stronger. The brand name was Valium. And unlike Librium, which had found its niche in psychiatric treatment, in the offices of psychiatrists and psychiatric hospitals, Valium was positioned for something far more ambitious: mass consumption. This was not a drug for the mentally ill, not a drug for people with diagnosed psychiatric conditions. This was a drug for America itself. This was a solution to the problem of modern life, to the existential anxiety of being a human in the middle of the 20th century. This was Hoffmann-La Roche's vision, a drug not just for patients but for everyone. The marketing campaign that followed was nothing short of genius, a blueprint for pharmaceutical seduction that would be studied in business schools, that would be analyzed in histories of advertising, that would be condemned in congressional hearings decades later. Hoffmann-La Roche did not advertise Valium to doctors in the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine and other medical journals alone, though they certainly did that. They advertised it everywhere. They took out advertisements in mainstream magazines that housewives read: Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's Family Circle. They created slick, emotionally manipulative advertisements featuring images of beleaguered housewives, harried businessmen dealing with corporate pressure, frazzled parents torn between competing demands, elderly people worried about health and mortality, and the relentless march of aging. All of them were caught in the machinery of modern expectation, all of them were drowning in stress, all of them were suffering. And in every advertisement, Valium appeared not as medicine in the traditional sense, not as a treatment for disease, but as permission. Permission to be anxious, permission to admit struggle, permission to acknowledge that you weren't coping perfectly, and then most importantly, permission to solve that struggle with a pill, permission to buy your way out of emotional distress. The ads were beautiful, they were professional, they looked like they belonged in these magazines. The messaging was almost insidiously perfect, so perfectly calibrated to the anxieties of the era that it seems almost impossible in retrospect that people didn't recognize it as propaganda. Valium wasn't being sold as a treatment for mental illness. It was being sold as a solution to the normal human experience of being alive in the modern world. Stressed about dinner parties, worried that you won't be the perfect hostess? Valium. Worried about your appearance, convinced that you don't measure up to cultural standards of beauty? Valium. Frustrated with your spouse, exhausted by the daily negotiations of marriage? Valium. Depressed about your life not matching your dreams? Valium. The pharmaceutical company had identified something profound and deeply troubling about American culture: our collective inability to sit with discomfort, to metabolize anxiety through conversation or reflection or any process that took time and effort and genuine emotional work. Instead, we could swallow a pill. The discomfort would dissolve, the anxiety would vanish, life would continue, the problem would be solved, everything would be better. And this was the particular genius of the marketing. It didn't actually promise to solve your problems. It promised to solve your emotional reaction to your problems. It was the difference between addressing the source of anxiety and addressing the symptom of anxiety. A woman anxious about her role in society, about her limited opportunities, about the contradictions she was asked to embody, would take Valium and feel less anxious about these things. But the conditions that created the anxiety remained unchanged. The woman would go back to being a housewife, but now she would be a less anxious housewife. She would accept her role more easily, she would be less likely to question it, she would become in essence easier to manage, easier to keep in her assigned position. What Hoffmann-La Roche was selling wasn't medicine. It was social control dressed up in pharmaceutical language. It was a way to make people accept the unacceptable. Doctors embraced Valium with enthusiasm that bordered on cultish devotion. Here was a drug they could prescribe for almost anything. Anxiety, yes of course, but also tension, headaches caused by stress, insomnia and sleep disturbance, muscle spasms and muscular tension, premenstrual syndrome and the emotional disturbances associated with menstruation, back pain, irritable bowel syndrome. The indications expanded relentlessly, like cancer metastasizing throughout the body. Valium was safe, the pharmaceutical company assured them. Valium was safe, the FDA had approved it. The medical literature, much of which was funded by the pharmaceutical company itself, supported its use. The company representatives, attractive and charming, visited doctors' offices bearing gifts and free samples and promises that Valium could help their patients. They told doctors that Valium was not addictive. They said it was the safe alternative to barbiturates. They provided glossy promotional materials with smiling faces and reassuring language. Prescriptions began to climb. By 1965, just 2 years after the drug was released, Valium had already become one of the most prescribed drugs in America. By 1970, it had become the #1 prescription medication. Not just the most prescribed psychiatric drug, not just the most prescribed drug for anxiety, the most prescribed drug of any kind, period. More than antibiotics, more than blood pressure medications, more than anything else in America. Hoffmann-La Roche had engineered something extraordinary, something that had never been accomplished before on such a massive scale. They had taken a symptom of being human, anxiety, and transformed it into a diagnosis requiring pharmaceutical intervention. The cultural moment was perfectly aligned for this transformation. This was the era of what would come to be called Mother's Little Helper, a phrase that would be immortalized in a 1966 Rolling Stones song of the same name. The song captured something dark and satirical about what was happening in America, about what we were choosing to do. The lyrics spoke of a mother dealing with her day, managing the overwhelming demands of housewifery and motherhood through chemical means. The song was marketed as social commentary, as critique, as a clever observation about cultural pathology. And yet, millions of actual mothers were doing exactly what the song described. They were taking pills to manage the impossible demands placed upon them, to quiet the legitimate anxiety that arose from impossible expectations. Rather than questioning the system that made housewifery feel like an unbearable burden, rather than asking why women were expected to manage all of this alone, rather than examining the structural injustices that created the anxiety in the first place, the solution was to chemically adjust the woman to fit the role. Valium made the unbearable bearable. It did not question why bearing the unbearable had become a woman's duty. It did not ask whether the role itself might be the problem. It simply made her numb to her own resentment, numb to her own desires, numb to her own sense that something might be fundamentally wrong. The numbers climbed relentlessly. By 1972, Hoffmann-La Roche was producing and selling a staggering volume of Valium. At the height of its popularity, the company was manufacturing approximately 2 million pills per single day. 2 million, every day, every single day. The economics were staggering beyond belief. A drug that cost pennies to manufacture, literally pennies per pill when you account for the cost of raw materials and basic production, was selling for dollars. A pill that cost 3 cents to make was sold for 50 cents or $1. The profit margins were astronomical. Valium had become a cash cow of unprecedented proportions. A pharmaceutical company had created a product that was profitable beyond imagination, that was being consumed by millions of Americans, that was becoming increasingly central to how American society functioned. And the company had every incentive to keep the cow producing milk, to keep the prescriptions flowing, to keep the pills being consumed. Profits were soaring, shareholders were delighted, the company was printing money. Here is where we must pause and acknowledge something uncomfortable, something that the pharmaceutical company would have much preferred to remain obscured. The pharmaceutical companies knew what they were doing. This was not accidental. This was not the unintended consequence of good faith medical practice. Marketing to doctors was one thing that was standard practice in the pharmaceutical industry. That was how drugs had been sold for decades. but marketing directly to consumers through the pages of mainstream magazines, creating demand that didn't necessarily exist based on any genuine medical need, reshaping cultural understanding of what constituted a mental health problem. This was something different. This was creating the market for anxiety medication. This was teaching America that anxiety was a medical problem requiring pharmaceutical solution. This was reshaping the cultural conversation around emotional distress, transforming what had been understood as a normal part of human experience into a pathology requiring treatment. The company understood the power of this strategy. Consider the context carefully. This was the era of second-wave feminism. Women were beginning to question their assigned roles with increasing urgency. They were entering the workforce in greater numbers. They were demanding equal rights and recognition. They were reading books like The Feminine Mystique and recognizing that the perfect suburban life they had been promised was actually a prison. But the cultural resistance was fierce and organized. The expectation remained that a woman should be a perfect mother, a perfect wife, a perfect homemaker, producing clean homes and well-adjusted children and perfect meals, while increasingly also being expected to contribute income to the household. The contradiction was impossible. The anxiety was rational and understandable. And into this impossible situation, Valium arrived like a chemical embrace. It didn't solve the problem. It couldn't possibly solve the problem because the problem was structural, embedded in the very organization of society. But it made the problem feel manageable. It allowed women to accept the unacceptable by making them chemically indifferent to it. The medication became the solution instead of the situation changing. The statistics are haunting when you examine them closely. By the mid-1970s, women were receiving more Valium prescriptions than men by a ratio of almost 2 to 1. The drug was being prescribed to housewives for the stress of housework, as if housework was the problem rather than the structural expectation that a woman should find fulfillment in domestic labor. It was being prescribed to mothers for the frustration of motherhood, suggesting that the frustration was a disorder in the mother rather than a reasonable response to an impossible situation. It was being prescribed to women experiencing what we would now call postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety, though in that era these conditions weren't recognized as distinct medical entities requiring specialized treatment. They were just seen as a woman's failure to adapt, a woman's inability to cope, a woman's inability to rise to the occasion of motherhood. And Valium was the solution to her inadequacy. Rather than asking whether the medical establishment and society at large should be supporting new mothers differently, rather than asking what had changed in pregnancy and childbirth and infant care that might have created psychological vulnerability, the solution was to give the woman a pill. By 1978, the situation had reached a fever pitch that seems almost impossible to contemplate from the vantage point of the modern era. That year, American doctors wrote prescriptions for 2.3 billion Valium pills, 2,300,000,000 individual pills. For a nation of roughly 220 million people, that meant an average of more than 10 pills per person per year, and that's dividing equally across every man, woman, and child, including infants and newborns who would never take a pill. The actual distribution was far more concentrated. Hundreds of millions of pills were going to people who had absolutely no use for them. Millions of Americans were taking Valium regularly, every single day. Hundreds of thousands were dependent on it, unable to function without it. And yet the prescribing continued unabated. The pharmaceutical company continued to market, the doctors continued to prescribe, the pills continued to flow, the empire continued to grow, the machinery kept spinning. The pharmaceutical marketing machine had become sophisticated beyond what anyone had previously imagined possible. It was, in many ways, the birth of modern pharmaceutical marketing. Hoffmann-La Roche sponsored medical conferences where doctors gathered to learn about new developments in psychiatry and medicine. They funded continuing medical education for doctors who needed to maintain their credentials and stay informed about new treatments. They sent pharmaceutical representatives, often young, attractive women dressed professionally, to doctors' offices to hand out free samples of Valium and glossy promotional materials emphasizing its benefits. They published studies in medical journals, many of which were funded by the company itself, ensuring that the results were favorable to their product. They bought advertising space in medical journals. They created an information ecosystem entirely devoted to promoting the idea that Valium was safe, beneficial, and appropriate for nearly any situation involving anxiety or stress. This was the infrastructure of pharmaceutical persuasion, and it was remarkably effective. Doctors trusted the information they were receiving because it came from apparently objective medical sources. The advertising copy was masterful in its manipulation of human psychology and emotion. One memorable advertisement from the 1970s showed a woman at her kitchen sink, surrounded by children looking harried and overwhelmed by the demands being placed upon her. She was struggling, she was exhausted, she looked like she was at the breaking point. The caption read something to the effect of, "You can't eliminate the stress in her world, but you can eliminate her anxiety about it." Think about what that means. You cannot change the conditions that are making this person suffer. You cannot address the structural inequality that assigns all domestic labor to her while she is also expected to work. You cannot create time for her. You cannot reduce the expectations placed upon her. You cannot fundamentally alter her situation, but you can chemically suppress her ability to feel distressed about those conditions. You can make her accept the unacceptable. You can take a human being who is legitimately overwhelmed and make her feel less overwhelmed about her overwhelm. This was not medicine in any meaningful sense. This was pharmaceutical social control. This was asking not what was wrong with society, but how to make people stop noticing that something was wrong. But beneath the advertising and the marketing and the growing prescription numbers, beyond the glossy ads in women's magazines and the pharmaceutical representatives visiting doctors' offices, something else was happening that nobody wanted to acknowledge. People were becoming addicted, not in the way that barbiturate addiction looked, not with the obvious withdrawal seizures and delirium that signaled to doctors that their patients had a problem. Benzodiazepine addiction was more subtle. It crept up slowly, so gradually that nobody noticed it happening until it was too late. A person taking Valium as prescribed would find that after a few months of regular use, they felt a bit worse when they didn't take their daily pill. Perhaps they felt more anxious than baseline. Perhaps they felt physically uncomfortable, their muscles tight, their skin crawling, an undefined sense of malaise. The reasonable response was to continue taking the pill. What else could they do? The pill had been prescribed by a doctor. It was approved by the FDA. The problem was their anxiety, not the pill. The pill was the solution. The pill must be correct. But something insidious was happening at the neurochemical level, something that the pharmaceutical company knew about, something that appeared in internal company documents but never in the marketing materials or the medical literature they controlled. Benzodiazepines work by enhancing the activity of GABA, a neurotransmitter that calms neural activity throughout the brain and nervous system. When you take Valium regularly, every single day for weeks and months and years, your brain adapts to the presence of the drug. It produces less GABA naturally, compensating for the external supply provided by the medication. Your neural receptors become less sensitive to GABA. The brain is always seeking equilibrium, always trying to maintain balance. As the drug becomes a constant presence, the baseline resets. The brain learns to operate with Valium in its system. Now remove the Valium and suddenly the brain is operating with insufficient GABA activity. The result is not a return to the baseline from before you started taking the drug. The result is a state worse than the baseline. You feel more anxious than you ever did before taking the drug. You feel physically ill. Your muscles ache. Your skin crawls with paresthesia, the sensation of phantom sensations. Sleep becomes impossible. Your mind races with intrusive thoughts. Your heart feels like it's racing in your chest. Withdrawal from benzodiazepines is a genuinely terrible experience. It is a hell of your own creation, or rather, a hell created for you by the medication that was supposed to help you. And here is the cruel irony that nobody in the early days of benzodiazepine use wanted to acknowledge, that the pharmaceutical company certainly didn't advertise, that appeared in medical literature but was largely ignored or downplayed. Withdrawal from Valium is worse than withdrawal from heroin. This is not hyperbole. This is not metaphor. This is documented medical fact, established through comparison of withdrawal syndromes. Heroin withdrawal is acutely miserable, profoundly uncomfortable, a kind of hell that lasts for days or weeks. But heroin withdrawal is not typically life-threatening. Benzodiazepine withdrawal can cause seizures, it can cause delirium, it can cause hallucinatory experiences where the withdrawing person loses touch with reality. It can be fatal, particularly in those already vulnerable to health problems. And yet doctors were casually prescribing Valium to millions of people without adequately warning them about this possibility. The pharmaceutical company certainly wasn't advertising it. They weren't putting it in the patient information. The medical establishment wasn't shouting it from the rooftops. So people took their pills, felt better, and after years of daily use found themselves trapped. The very thing that was supposed to solve their anxiety problem had become their primary source of anxiety. They were dependent on Valium and they had no idea how to get off it, and worse, they were terrified to try because they had heard or read or experienced how terrible withdrawal could be. By the early 1980s, reports were beginning to emerge from the medical community. stories that could no longer be completely suppressed or ignored. Medical journals started publishing articles documenting benzodiazepine dependence. Some doctors, those who were paying attention, those who were listening to their patients, those who were willing to see what was happening in front of them, were sounding alarms. But the pharmaceutical industry had enormous power. They had spent decades building relationships with doctors. They had funded research. They had shaped the medical curriculum at universities and medical schools. They had convinced the entire medical establishment that Valium was a miracle drug. Fighting against that was like fighting the tide with your bare hands. The momentum of an industry, the inertia of medical practice, the vested interest in defending the status quo, these were powerful forces. The incentives were all wrong. Meanwhile, the cultural myth of Valium had taken on a life of its own in the world of popular culture. Valium became synonymous with pharmaceutical escapism. Musicians referenced it in songs. Actors joked about it in interviews. It became part of the cultural landscape, woven into the fabric of American life so thoroughly that it seemed almost natural, almost inevitable. If you were anxious, you took a Valium. If you couldn't sleep, you took a Valium. If you were stressed, you took a Valium. It was that simple, it was that normalized, it was that invisible as a problem. But some problems refuse to stay invisible forever. They metastasize. They grow until they can no longer be ignored. The problem with Valium was growing in the most visible places imaginable, in the halls of hospitals, in the homes of ordinary Americans, in the lives of celebrities who couldn't keep their drug use private. In 1977, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, died in his Graceland mansion. He was only 42 years old. The cause was officially listed as cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat that his heart couldn't compensate for, but the autopsy revealed something far more complicated. Elvis had been taking an enormous quantity of prescription medications, a pharmaceutical cocktail that included multiple benzodiazepines, along with other drugs including amphetamines and various other medications prescribed by his personal physicians. The combination had likely contributed to his death. His heart, weakened by years of excess and stress, had finally given out. But even more significant than Elvis's individual death, which was already tragic enough, was what it represented to the nation. It was the collapse of a cultural icon into pharmaceutical dependency. Elvis had been a god to generations of Americans, and he was a god who had become dependent on pills. He was a god who had become addicted to drugs that were supposed to be safe. The tragedy wasn't just his death. The tragedy was what it suggested about the entire system that had created this situation. Elvis wasn't an anomaly. He was an extreme case of a widespread phenomenon. He had access to more doctors and more pills than the average American. He had the wealth to obtain multiple prescriptions from different physicians. He had the star power to convince doctors to prescribe whatever he asked for. So his addiction had reached more dramatic proportions. His drug use had spiraled to more extreme levels. But the mechanism was identical to what was happening to millions of ordinary Americans. The only difference was one of degree, not of kind. In 1979, there were other deaths. Deaths that got less publicity, deaths that didn't make national headlines, but deaths nonetheless. Other celebrity deaths, mostly because those were the deaths that got reported widely, that got journalists interested, that got the public's attention. Celebrity deaths got headlines, but in homes across America, away from the spotlight, something darker was happening. Elderly people were falling and breaking their hips because Valium impaired their balance and coordination, affecting their proprioception and their ability to move safely through space. They would fall. They would break bones. They would spiral into dependence and institutionalization. People were driving while intoxicated on benzodiazepines, not recognizing their own impairment, not realizing that their reaction times were slowed, their judgment impaired, their ability to drive safely compromised. They were having car accidents. They were killing themselves and others. Suicide rates were climbing among people taking Valium, as the drug sometimes increased suicidal ideation, particularly in younger users, while simultaneously impairing judgment and impulse control, removing the cognitive barriers that might otherwise prevent a person from acting on suicidal thoughts. A particular crisis was emerging among the elderly population. Doctors had been prescribing Valium to older Americans for decades, beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Many of them had been taking it continuously since the very beginning of the Valium era. They were now in their 70s and 80s, still taking the same pills they'd been prescribed decades earlier. But in aging bodies, the drugs accumulated. The elderly metabolized medications differently than younger people. What had been a therapeutic dose in a 40-year-old became a toxic dose in an 80-year-old. The drug lingered longer in their bodies. It built up in their tissues. Elderly people on benzodiazepines were experiencing cognitive impairment that looked remarkably similar to Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, confusion, difficulty with basic cognitive tasks. They were falling repeatedly, suffering fractures that in elderly people often meant the beginning of a downward spiral toward institutionalization and dependence. They were becoming increasingly dependent and requiring care, and nobody was connecting the dots. Nobody was asking whether these drugs that had been prescribed to these people so many years ago might be causing more harm than good in this population. Nobody was suggesting that stopping the benzodiazepines might improve their cognitive function and their physical safety. By the early 1980s, the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore, even for those with a vested interest in ignoring it. Medical journals published increasingly urgent warnings. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1982 demonstrated that benzodiazepine use was associated with an increased risk of motor vehicle accidents. The data was clear and unambiguous. People taking benzodiazepines were more likely to have car accidents. Another study showed that long-term use led to permanent cognitive impairment and memory problems that persisted even after the drugs were discontinued. The data was accumulating, the evidence was becoming clear. Valium and its relatives were causing harm, they were harming the elderly, they were harming drivers, they were harming people trying to work, they were harming society in measurable, quantifiable ways. But here is where we encounter something deeply troubling about the relationship between pharmaceutical companies, the medical establishment, and the government. Hoffmann-La Roche had no incentive to stop selling Valium. The drug was extraordinarily profitable. It was generating enormous revenues. The company had built an entire business around benzodiazepine medications. They had relationships with thousands of doctors, relationships that had been carefully built and nurtured through decades of marketing and sponsorship and personal relationships. The medical establishment, meanwhile, had a vested interest in defending the status quo. Acknowledging that Valium was dangerous would mean acknowledging that millions of doctors had harmed their patients. It would mean admitting professional culpability. It would mean confronting the question of what to do about the millions of people already dependent on these drugs. It would mean questioning the entire basis of psychiatric practice over the past 2 decades. The government, theoretically, was supposed to be protecting the public. The Food and Drug Administration should have been investigating, Congress should have been asking hard questions, and eventually some people did ask questions, but the process was glacially slow, and by the time it happened, the damage had already been done. In 1979, Congress held hearings on benzodiazepine abuse. Representatives from Hoffmann-La Roche testified before Congress. They assured the members of Congress that Valium was safe when used as directed, when used according to medical recommendations. They argued that the problem wasn't the drug, it was the behavior of doctors who were overprescribing. They framed the issue as a medical practice issue, not a pharmaceutical company issue. They presented data that had been carefully selected to support their narrative of safety, and they had an enormous amount of credibility in the eyes of Congress. They were a major pharmaceutical company. They had relationships with powerful politicians. They had funded research at universities where congressmen's constituents worked. They had shaped the conversation around benzodiazepines through years of marketing and influence. What the pharmaceutical company didn't openly acknowledge in these hearings, what would later emerge in internal documents and lawsuits and investigations, was something that would prove to be damning. They had known for years that benzodiazepines carried a significant risk of dependence. The company's own scientists had documented this. The company's own research, conducted internally, had identified the problem clearly. The researchers working for Hoffmann-La Roche had understood that Valium was addictive. And yet the marketing campaign had continued to present Valium as a safe, non-addictive alternative to barbiturates. The implicit message was that you could take this drug indefinitely without risk. That was not true. The company knew it was not true. The company's own scientists knew it was not true. And they marketed the drug anyway, knowing that the marketing was misleading, knowing that the public was being deceived, knowing that millions of people would become dependent on a drug that they were told was safe. In 1980, the FDA issued new guidelines recommending that benzodiazepines be used only for short-term treatment of anxiety, typically no more than 2 to 4 weeks. The recommendation came far too late. By that time, millions of Americans were already taking these drugs chronically, often for years or decades. The recommendation also highlighted the profound disconnect between pharmaceutical marketing and medical reality. If the drugs were truly only appropriate for short-term use, if the medical science only supported 2 to 4 weeks of therapy, why had they been advertised and prescribed for indefinite use? Why had the marketing materials suggested that Valium was appropriate for the ongoing stress of modern life, for use whenever someone felt anxious? The answer, of course, was obvious: profit. A drug that could be taken for 2 weeks would generate a fraction of the revenue of a drug that people took for 20 years. A drug that was prescribed chronically would transform a temporary patient into a permanent customer. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the benzodiazepine dependence crisis continued to worsen, metastasizing through American society like a slow-moving cancer. People who had been taking Valium since the 1960s, since the very beginning of the benzodiazepine era, were now experiencing profound physical and psychological dependence. Many of them wanted to stop. Some of them tried to stop. The withdrawal was so severe, so genuinely terrible that many couldn't complete it without medical support, but there was no treatment infrastructure. There were no specialized benzodiazepine withdrawal programs. There were no protocols for safe tapering. Doctors who acknowledged the problem didn't know how to help. Some patients undertook rapid tapering, which was dangerous and often unsuccessful. Others chose to suffer through the withdrawal at home, enduring weeks of misery. Some couldn't bear it and remained on the drugs indefinitely, dependent on pills that they despised, that had become prisons, that they felt trapped by but also terrified to discontinue. A new problem also emerged, one that had been largely invisible in the early days of benzodiazepine use: tolerance. People who had been taking the same dose of Valium for 15 or 20 years found that it no longer worked. Their bodies had adapted to the presence of the drug. They needed more of the drug to achieve the same effect. This is what tolerance looks like. The brain adapts, the receptors become less sensitive, the system reaches a new equilibrium. And suddenly the dose that had been therapeutic is no longer sufficient. Some doctors, recognizing this problem, increased doses. Some switched patients to newer benzodiazepines, hoping that a fresh drug might work where tolerance had reduced the effectiveness of the old one. Some acknowledged the problem and began the difficult process of gradually tapering patients off the drugs. But for many patients, the trajectory was one of escalating doses and deepening dependence, of becoming more and more trapped, of needing more and more drug to feel normal, of watching their lives become increasingly organized around maintaining their benzodiazepine supply. By the 1990s, Valium's dominance in the benzodiazepine market had been challenged by newer drugs, by pharmaceutical competitors that had learned from Valium's success and sought to capture a piece of the lucrative benzodiazepine market. Alprazolam, marketed under the brand name Xanax, had emerged as a competitor. Xanax was shorter-acting than Valium, which meant it provided faster symptom relief. This made it even more addictive than Valium. The faster the onset of action, the greater the addictive potential. Xanax became the preferred benzodiazepine for people seeking the kind of immediate anxiety relief that the drug provided. The prescription shifted from Valium to Xanax, from one benzodiazepine to another, but the underlying problem remained identical. A new generation of Americans was becoming dependent on benzodiazepines, using the same mechanisms, facing the same withdrawal problems, caught in the same pharmaceutical trap that had ensnared millions before them. The machinery continued. The crisis evolved but did not end. Throughout this period, there was also a growing recognition of something else, something darker and more dangerous that nobody in the marketing departments wanted to acknowledge: sexual and physical abuse. Research began to emerge, studies from universities and hospitals, suggesting that benzodiazepines were being used as date rape drugs. Rohypnol, a benzodiazepine that was not approved for use in the United States but was available in other countries, became notorious as a drug used to render victims unconscious for sexual assault, used by predators to incapacitate their victims. But even prescription benzodiazepines could serve this function. They could incapacitate. They could prevent memory formation so that the victim would have no recollection of what happened. They could leave victims unable to resist or remember what had happened to them. Valium had been designed to solve one problem: anxiety, but it had created 1,000 others. It had solved the problem of housewives being anxious about their impossible lives. And it had created problems of addiction, dependence, cognitive impairment, safety issues, and criminal misuse that would persist for decades. The legal system began to catch up slowly over the course of decades. Hoffmann-La Roche faced lawsuits. People who had become dependent on Valium sued the company for failing to warn them about the addiction potential. States began restricting how benzodiazepines could be prescribed. Some states implemented prescription monitoring programs designed to track benzodiazepine prescriptions and prevent people from doctor shopping, going to multiple doctors to obtain multiple benzodiazepine prescriptions. The DEA scheduled benzodiazepines as Schedule IV controlled substances, which meant they had some legal restrictions on how they could be prescribed and dispensed, but the restrictions were half-hearted, inadequate. Benzodiazepines could still be prescribed. Doctors could still prescribe them. The fundamental problem remained. By the beginning of the 21st century, the medical establishment had largely accepted what should have been obvious decades earlier, that benzodiazepines carried significant risks and that they should be used much more cautiously than they had been in previous decades. Guidelines from major medical organizations, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association, recommended short-term use only. They recommended caution in prescribing to the elderly. They recommended avoiding benzodiazepines in pregnant women. They recommended tapering and discontinuation whenever possible. But even with these guidelines in place, benzodiazepine prescribing remained widespread. Millions of Americans continued to take these drugs. Many of them wanted to stop but couldn't. Many of them had been on the drugs for so long that they couldn't imagine functioning without them. Some of them had become dependent as teenagers and were now adults whose entire life had been lived on benzodiazepines. The problem had also shifted geographically and demographically. Whereas Valium in the 1970s had been quintessentially associated with suburban housewives, white women in comfortable homes, educated and privileged, benzodiazepine use in the 2000s was more distributed across different populations. Veterans were being prescribed benzodiazepines for PTSD and anxiety related to combat trauma. They were being given pills to manage the aftermath of war, pills that would eventually create their own problems and their own dependencies. Opioid users were being prescribed benzodiazepines alongside their painkillers, a combination that dramatically increased overdose risk, that created a synergistic toxicity when the two drugs were combined in the body. People with mental health conditions like anxiety disorders and panic disorder were being prescribed benzodiazepines as long-term treatment, despite evidence that they lost effectiveness over time and carried addiction risk. The benzodiazepine problem had evolved, but it had not been solved. It had transformed, adapting to new populations, new indications, new medical contexts. And then came the opioid crisis, that catastrophic public health emergency that would define the early 21st century, and the picture became even more complicated and tragic. As overdose deaths from opioids began to skyrocket in the 2010s, climbing from thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, researchers investigating the deaths identified that a significant proportion of opioid overdose deaths involved benzodiazepines. The two drugs in combination were profoundly dangerous. They both depressed the central nervous system, they both suppressed respiration, they both impaired consciousness. Together, they created a perfect storm of overdose risk. Respiratory depression from both drugs meant that overdose could occur at lower doses than would be lethal with opioids alone. And yet, many pain management doctors continue to prescribe both drugs simultaneously to chronic pain patients, continuing a practice that had begun decades earlier and had proven its lethality over and over again. Some patients obtained benzodiazepines from different doctors, creating drug combinations that nobody was monitoring or aware of. Some patients bought benzodiazepines on the black market to enhance their opioid high. The benzodiazepine crisis had metastasized into the opioid crisis, had become part of the mechanism of the larger disaster. The tragedy of Valium's rise and fall is not just the story of a single drug, not just a pharmaceutical history lesson about one medication that went wrong. It is the story of how a nation chose to chemically manage the problems of existence rather than confront them. It is the story of how pharmaceutical companies identified human suffering and reframed it as a medical problem requiring pharmaceutical solution. It is the story of how doctors, well-intentioned but uninformed or willfully ignorant, became agents of pharmaceutical marketing rather than advocates for their patients' well-being. It is the story of how the FDA, supposed to protect the public, failed to act with adequate speed and force. It is the story of how Congress, supposed to represent the people, failed to demand accountability. And it is the story of how millions of people, seeking relief from legitimate suffering, found themselves trapped in chemical dependency by an industry that knew the risks and marketed the drugs anyway. The statistics from the Valium era are staggering when you contemplate them, when you really sit with the numbers and understand what they represent in human terms. An estimated 12 million Americans became dependent on benzodiazepines during the 1970s and 1980s. That's one person in every 20. That's your neighbor, that's your cousin, that's your friend's mother. The number grew in subsequent decades. By the 2010s, roughly 4% of the American population was taking benzodiazepines on a regular basis. Some of them were new prescriptions. Many of them were people who had been taking the drugs for decades, unable to stop despite genuine desire to do so. The deaths were real, the overdoses were real. The permanent cognitive damage from long-term benzodiazepine use was real. The destroyed families, the lost productivity, the human suffering, all of it was real. And nearly all of it was preventable, if the pharmaceutical company had been honest about the addiction potential. If the FDA had acted more swiftly, with more authority, with more skepticism toward pharmaceutical industry claims. If doctors had been more cautious. If the marketing had been honest. If society had chosen to address the root causes of anxiety rather than simply medicate it away. But that's not what happened. What happened was that Hoffmann-La Roche continued to make enormous profits. The company eventually sold off its benzodiazepine division, but not before raking in billions of dollars over decades. The doctors who had overprescribed continued to practice, largely without consequence, largely without any meaningful accountability. The pharmaceutical industry learned invaluable lessons about how to market addictive drugs and how to manage public relations around pharmaceutical crises, lessons that would be applied to subsequent drugs, lessons that would shape pharmaceutical marketing for decades to come. The FDA's response was inadequate, and it would remain inadequate in future pharmaceutical crises, as the agency continued to be insufficiently skeptical of pharmaceutical company claims, insufficiently protective of the public. And society developed a deeper, more profound belief that the answer to human suffering was pharmaceutical intervention, that the solution to the problems of being human was to be found in pills. The legacy of Valium did not end with the drug itself. It set a template. It demonstrated that pharmaceutical companies could take human experience, anxiety, stress, sleeplessness, dissatisfaction, the normal difficulties of being alive, and reframe it as disease. It demonstrated that doctors could be convinced to prescribe drugs far more broadly than medical evidence warranted. It demonstrated that marketing could shape medical practice more effectively than science could. It demonstrated that profit could take precedence over safety. It demonstrated that even when the problems became visible, even when the evidence was clear, the response would be slow, half-hearted, and ultimately inadequate to address the scale of the harm. When the opioid crisis emerged in the 2000s and 2010s, many of the same patterns repeated, but with far greater devastation and loss of life. Pharmaceutical companies marketed opioids, particularly extended-release formulations, as safe and non-addictive when the evidence showed otherwise. This was a lie, a documented deception. They funded research that supported this false narrative. They educated doctors about pain management in ways that emphasized opioids while downplaying addiction risk. Doctors prescribed them widely, often for conditions where evidence didn't support their use, for chronic pain conditions where the long-term dangers of opioid therapy had not been adequately considered. The DEA and FDA were slow to respond, just as they had been slow with benzodiazepines. Millions of Americans became addicted. Hundreds of thousands died. The response, even as it unfolded, was inadequate. We were watching the Valium crisis repeat itself, but on a much larger scale with far more devastating consequences. The lesson was not learned, the pattern was repeating. The question that remains, the question that should haunt us as we contemplate our pharmaceutical present, is this: what will we look back on in 20 years and realize we got catastrophically wrong? What medications are we prescribing today with the confidence of the 1960s Valium doctors? What are we medicalizing that should not be medicalized? What profit motive is driving pharmaceutical marketing in ways that we don't yet see? What are we telling ourselves about safety that we'll later realize was simply not true? The story of Valium is not primarily a story about Valium. It is a story about a culture that chose to medicate its anxiety away rather than confront it. It is a story about a system where profit and public health were fundamentally misaligned, where the incentive to sell drugs overwhelmed the imperative to do no harm. It is a story about professional bodies that failed to adequately protect the public. It is a story about how even when the truth becomes visible, even when the evidence is clear, inertia and institutional interest can prevent meaningful change. And most importantly, it is a story about the people who were harmed. The housewives who took pills to accept the unacceptable, the elderly who lost their cognitive function, the celebrities who overdosed, the millions of ordinary Americans who became dependent on drugs they didn't want to be dependent on, prescribed by doctors who didn't understand the risks, marketed by a company that knew the risks and sold the drug anyway. These people deserved better. They deserved doctors who would listen to their suffering without immediately reaching for a prescription pad. They deserved a pharmaceutical industry accountable to public health rather than shareholder value. They deserved a government that would protect them from harm. We are even now in an era of unprecedented pharmaceutical prescription. We are even now medicalizing human experience. We are even now allowing profit to drive pharmaceutical development and marketing. The story of Valium is not a historical artifact. It is a template that continues to shape how we understand health, illness, and the role of medication in human life. The rise and fall of Valium teaches us something essential about the relationship between commerce and health, between marketing and truth, between what we're told and what is actually real. What we do with that knowledge is our responsibility. The story is still being written. The question is what kind of ending we will choose.